My name is Susan, and I'm 68 years old. Today, I live peacefully in a small coastal village in Portugal, far from my old life in Seattle. I never thought my only son, Thomas, would betray me so cruelly. The beautiful home I worked decades to pay for and then gave to him became my prison when he locked me in the bathroom for 2 days. That's when I made the decision that changed everything. I sold his house right from under him and disappeared. Before I tell you how my only child betrayed me and how I reclaimed my life, let me know where you're watching from and tap that subscribe button if you've ever had to stand up for yourself when family turned against you. My story begins long before that bathroom door locked behind me. I became a widow at 42 when my husband Michael died suddenly of a heart attack. He left me with our 12-year-old son Thomas and a mortgage we'd barely started paying. Those early years were incredibly difficult. I threw myself into my career as a real estate agent, working 60-hour weeks while somehow managing to attend Thomas' soccer games and school events. We were close back then, or at least I thought we were. Thomas was a bright, charming boy with his father's smile and my determination. I remember how he'd wait up for me on nights I had late showings just so he could hear about the houses I'd seen that day. He seemed fascinated by my work, though. In hindsight, perhaps it was the money that interested him more than the profession itself. I saved every penny I could for his college fund. When Thomas got accepted to Washington University, I remortgaged our modest home to help pay his tuition. "Mom, when I'm successful, I'll pay you back for everything," he promised the day I dropped him off at his dormitory. I told him the only payment I wanted was his happiness. During college, I noticed subtle changes in Thomas. He began running with a wealthier crowd, coming home with designer clothes I knew he couldn't afford. When I asked about it, he'd say they were gifts from friends or incredible deals he'd found. I wanted to believe him. After graduation, Thomas landed a job at a financial firm in downtown Seattle. That's where he met Heather, a beautiful marketing executive with ambition that matched his own. I liked her initially. She was polite, intelligent, and seemed to make my son happy. They married after dating for just over a year in an extravagant ceremony that cost more than Thomas's entire college education. I questioned the expense privately, but said nothing. I wanted to be supportive. Their first child, my grandson Jack, arrived a year later, followed by little Lily 2 years after that. Those early grandparent years were some of the happiest of my life. I'd babysit whenever they asked, bringing homemade cookies and small gifts. The children adored me, and I them. Lily would run to the door shouting, "Grammy," whenever I arrived, and Jack always wanted to show me his latest Lego creation. Those moments felt pure and untainted. Meanwhile, my own career had flourished. 35 years in Seattle real estate had built me a solid reputation and comfortable savings. Thomas was climbing the corporate ladder too, but I began noticing concerning signs. Despite his six-figure salary, he and Heather always seemed stretched thin financially. Their lifestyle with the luxury cars, designer wardrobes, and exclusive preschools for the children consumed everything they earned and more. They began asking for loans that were never repaid. First for small amounts, then increasingly larger sums. When Jack was 7 and Lily 5, Thomas asked for $40,000 to cover what he called temporary cash flow issues. I provided it without hesitation, though I never saw that money again. Around this time, I also noticed the first signs of them limiting my access to my grandchildren. Birthday party invitations would come at the last minute, giving me no time to purchase appropriate gifts. When I'd arranged to take the children for the weekend, plans would be cancelled hours before because of suddenly remembered soccer practices or play dates. The children's natural affection for me began to seem rehearsed, as though they'd been coached on how to interact with their grandmother. Jack stopped making eye contact during conversations. Lily no longer ran to greet me. When I brought it up with Thomas, he dismissed my concerns, saying I was being oversensitive. At 65, I retired from real estate. I'd amassed enough savings to live comfortably and had plans to travel, perhaps even take the grandchildren on special trips. I looked forward to spending my golden years creating memories with the family I loved so dearly. I couldn't have imagined how quickly those dreams would shatter. After retiring, I began considering what to do with my home, a beautiful four-bedroom craftsman, in one of Seattle's most desirable neighborhoods. I'd purchased it when Thomas was in high school, slowly renovating it room by room until it became the showpiece it was. Current market value, around $1.8 million. Thomas and Heather had been renting a home in the same school district, but I knew they struggled with the high monthly payments. Their rented house was half the size of mine, and with growing children, they were constantly complaining about the lack of space. One Sunday dinner at their place, after watching Jack and Lily squabble over whose turn it was to use the family computer in their shared bedroom, I made a decision that seemed perfectly logical at the time. "I've been thinking," I said as Thomas served dessert. "This house is too big for just me now. I'm considering downsizing to a condo, something easier to manage." Heather's eyes lit up immediately. "That makes sense, Susan. Where are you thinking of looking?" "Actually," I continued, "I was wondering if you might want my house. I could sign it over to you, keep my name on the deed as co-owner for now, but you could live there. I'd find something smaller nearby." The excitement that flashed between Thomas and Heather should have been my first warning. They accepted with what seemed like gratitude, but in retrospect felt more like triumph. We arranged for an attorney to handle the property transfer with me, retaining co-ownership since the house was fully paid off and represented the bulk of my retirement security. Within 2 months, they had moved into my home, and I had purchased a lovely 2-bedroom condo just 15 minutes away. I kept a few cherished pieces of furniture, but gave them most of my belongings, thinking it would help them settle in more quickly. "The house already feels like it's always been ours," Heather commented during my first visit after they'd moved in. "Not yours too, or still partly yours, but ours." It was a subtle distinction that pinched at me, though I pushed the feeling away. More concerning changes followed rapidly. When I'd call before visiting, which I always did out of courtesy, Heather would often say they were just heading out, or in the middle of something important. My spontaneous visits to see my grandchildren dwindled to carefully orchestrated appointments, always when it was convenient for them. Then came the renovations. Without consulting me, they began making significant changes to the house. The beautiful vintage kitchen I'd lovingly restored was gutted and replaced with ultra-modern appliances and cold marble countertops. The backyard garden, where I'd grown vegetables and flowers for years, was paved over for an entertainment patio. "We should have asked you first," Thomas said when he saw my shock, though his tone lacked genuine remorse. "But we figured, since we're living here now, we should make it work for our lifestyle." When I mentioned that some of these changes might affect the home's character and value, Thomas became defensive. "Actually, Mom, we need to talk about financing these improvements. The contractor needs another $20,000 to finish the basement conversion." This became a pattern. Every few months, there would be another essential renovation requiring my financial input. I later discovered they had been taking out home equity loans against the property, something they could do because Thomas's name was now on the deed. Meanwhile, my relationship with my grandchildren grew increasingly strained. Heather began scheduling their activities during my designated visiting times. Jack and Lily were enrolled in so many after-school programs and weekend sports that finding time with them became nearly impossible. "They're at such important developmental stages," Heather explained when I expressed my hurt. "These activities are critical for their future success." The final warning sign came during Thanksgiving of that year. I had always hosted the holiday dinner, but Heather announced they would be handling it at their house. When I arrived, I found they had invited Heather's entire extended family, but none of my few remaining friends whom I'd included in our gatherings for years. During dinner, I overheard Heather's mother ask her about when the house would be completely theirs. Heather's response was quiet but clear. "We're working on it, just a matter of time." That night, I searched through some papers Thomas had left in the guest room where I was staying. What I found chilled me to my core documents, from their attorney outlining strategies to have me declared mentally incompetent, which would allow Thomas to assume full control of all my assets, including complete ownership of the house. I went to bed that night with my mind racing, unsure of what my next step should be. I couldn't imagine confronting my own son with what I'd discovered. Yet I couldn't ignore it either. Little did I know events would soon force my hand in ways I never could have anticipated. 3 months after that revealing Thanksgiving disaster struck my condo, a major pipe burst while I was out having lunch with a former colleague, flooding my entire unit and causing extensive damage. When I returned home, water was pouring through my ceiling, my beautiful hardwood floors were buckling, and most of my furniture was ruined. The building manager informed me that repairs would take at least 2 months, possibly longer. Insurance would cover a hotel, but when Thomas heard about my situation, he insisted I stay with them. "Mom, it makes no sense for you to live in a hotel when we have plenty of space," he said, sounding like the caring son I remembered. "The guest suite in the basement is private with its own bathroom. You'll be comfortable there." Heather's tight smile should have warned me, but I was vulnerable and grateful. "It's only for a couple of weeks," she said, emphasizing the temporary nature of the arrangement. Those 2 weeks stretched into 3 months as complications with the condo repairs emerged. What had initially seemed like a blessing quickly devolved into a nightmare as tension in the household mounted with each passing day. The first week was deceptively pleasant. The children seemed happy to have me there, and I enjoyed making them breakfast before school. But by the second week, Heather began commenting on how I was disrupting their routine and confusing the children with different rules. "Susan, we appreciate you helping with breakfast, but the children need consistency," she said one morning. "We have a specific meal plan we follow for their nutritional needs." The basement guest suite, which had initially been presented as comfortable and private, became increasingly isolating. The children were forbidden from visiting me there without permission. When I'd come upstairs to the main living areas, conversations would halt abruptly. One evening, I returned earlier than expected from a doctor's appointment and overheard Thomas and Heather in heated discussion. "How much longer is she staying? This was supposed to be temporary," Heather hissed. "What am I supposed to do? Throw my mother out?" Thomas responded, though his tone lacked conviction. "She's never going to leave unless we make her," Heather continued. "And every day she's here costs us. Do you know how much extra we're spending on groceries and utilities?" I retreated quietly to my room, hurt beyond words. The next morning, I noticed that some of my belongings had been moved in the guest suite. My medication was in a different place, my journal had been shifted, and my laptop showed signs of having been opened. When I confronted Thomas about my privacy concerns, he dismissed them entirely. "Mom, nobody's touching your things. Maybe you're just forgetting where you put them. It happens at your age." That gaslighting became routine. If I couldn't find something, I was forgetful. If I remembered a conversation differently than they did, I was confused. If I expressed hurt at being excluded from family activities, I was oversensitive. Meanwhile, I began noticing unusual financial documents among Thomas's papers in the shared office space. Bank statements showing massive withdrawals, applications for second and third mortgages, and correspondence about missed payments. When I discreetly researched the property records online, I discovered that Thomas had borrowed heavily against the house, nearly $700,000 in new debt. One evening, while Thomas and Heather were attending a school function, I managed to access Thomas's email on the family computer he'd left open. What I found confirmed my worst fears. He'd been corresponding with the same attorney I'd seen documents from at Thanksgiving, now actively discussing having me evaluated by a sympathetic psychiatrist who could declare me incapable of managing my own affairs. Once we have control of the property outright, the attorney wrote, we can proceed with the additional equity withdrawal you've requested. They were planning to take everything I had worked for, while simultaneously pushing me out of my grandchildren's lives. The betrayal was almost too much to bear. When they returned home that night, I was waiting in the kitchen. I confronted Thomas with what I'd learned, trying to keep my voice calm and reasonable, despite my inner turmoil. I know what you're planning, Thomas. I've seen the emails, the documents about having me declared incompetent. His face went pale, then quickly flushed with anger. You had no right to go through my private communications. And you have no right to steal what I've worked my entire life for, I countered. I gave you this house out of love, not so you could use it to destroy me financially. Thomas's expression changed, then hardening, in a way I'd never seen before. You're clearly not well, Mom. This paranoid behavior proves exactly what we've been concerned about. You need help. The only thing I need is for you to stop lying and trying to take advantage of me, I said, standing my ground though my voice trembled. Heather walked in, then immediately sensing the confrontation. What's happening? Thomas turned to her. Mom's been snooping through my emails. She's making wild accusations. I think it's time we discussed alternative living arrangements, Heather said coldly. This clearly isn't working out. You're right about that, I replied. I'll be calling my attorney tomorrow and revoking the property transfer. As co-owner, I have every right to do that. The threat hit its mark. Thomas's face contorted with rage. You're not taking this house from us. Do you know how much we've put into it? How much debt we've taken on for improvements? Improvements I never approved and don't want to pay for, I said firmly. This ends now. What happened next still haunts me. Thomas stepped toward me, his face inches from mine, and spoke in a voice I'd never heard before. You're not doing anything. You're confused, possibly suffering from early dementia. No one would believe you over me. Before I could respond, he grabbed my arm roughly. You need to calm down. Go use the master bathroom to collect yourself. It's quieter in there. Confused by this sudden suggestion and his forceful grip, I allowed myself to be led upstairs to the master bedroom suite. The master bathroom was large and luxurious, one of my favorite renovations from years ago. Thomas practically pushed me inside. Take some time to think about what you're saying, Mom. We'll talk when you're more rational. And then I heard it, the decisive click of the door lock engaging from the outside. At first I thought it was a mistake. I jiggled the handle, called out Thomas's name, and waited for him to realize what had happened, and opened the door with an embarrassed apology. But the house went silent. Thomas, the door's locked. Can you open it, please? I called out, trying to keep the rising panic from my voice. No response. I knocked harder. Thomas, this isn't funny. Open the door right now. Still nothing. I pressed my ear against the door and heard muffled voices downstairs. Then the distinct sound of the front door closing and car engines starting. They were leaving. I pulled out my cell phone to call for help, only to find I had no service in the bathroom. The master bathroom was located in the center of the house, surrounded by thick walls that created a dead zone for cell reception. I'd noticed this issue years before, but never thought it would matter. I tried the door again this time, with more force, but it wouldn't budge. The lock was a solid brass fixture I'd installed during renovations, chosen specifically for its quality and durability. Now that very quality had become my prison. The bathroom was large, but had no windows. It featured a walk-in shower, a soaking tub, dual sinks, and a separate water closet. Under normal circumstances, it was a luxurious space. Now it felt like a beautifully appointed cell. I sat on the edge of the tub, trying to process what had just happened. Had my son, my only child, whom I'd sacrificed everything for, deliberately locked me in here? How long did he intend to keep me imprisoned? And what was he planning to do next? Hours passed with no sign of anyone returning. Night fell, and the bathroom grew dark except for the dim light filtering through the frosted skylight. I hadn't eaten since breakfast, and thirst was becoming a pressing concern. Thankfully, I had access to water from the sink, but food was another matter entirely. I searched through the bathroom cabinets and found some breath mints and a protein bar Heather kept for emergencies. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. I rationed the protein bar, taking small bites to make it last. Sleep was nearly impossible on the cold tile floor. I gathered all the towels from the linen cabinet to create a makeshift bed, but still found myself waking every hour disoriented and increasingly angry. By morning, I was certain this was no accident. I heard the family return, the children's voices echoing through the house. I pounded on the door and shouted until my voice grew hoarse. "Jack, Lily, can you hear me? It's Grandma. I'm locked in the bathroom." I heard footsteps approach, then Thomas's voice low and threatening. "Mom, you need to calm down. You were having an episode last night, making wild accusations and threatening us. We think you need some time to reflect on your behavior." "Thomas, this is kidnapping. You can't keep me locked in here," I shouted back. "No one's kidnapping you," he replied calmly. "You're staying in our home in a comfortable space with everything you need while we figure out next steps for your care. We're concerned about your mental state. Let me out right now or I'm calling the police," I threatened. I could almost hear his smirk through the door. "With what phone, Mom? There's no reception in there. Remember, that was your design choice." His footsteps retreated, and despite my continued calls, no one came back. I realized with growing horror that this was a calculated move. Thomas was setting the stage to have me declared incompetent, and my episode would be the evidence he needed. The second day was worse than the first. The hunger was becoming painful, and the isolation was wearing on my mental state. I alternated between fury and despair, sometimes crying uncontrollably, other times methodically searching the bathroom for anything that might help me escape. That afternoon, I heard Heather talking to someone in the bedroom. "Yes, we are very concerned about her behavior. Becoming paranoid, accusing us of stealing from her. Needs professional evaluation." She was laying the groundwork, telling someone, possibly a doctor or social worker, about my supposed mental decline. This wasn't just about keeping me locked away for a day or two. They were building a case against me. As the second night approached, I reached a breaking point. I would not be a victim. I would not allow my son to destroy everything I'd built and take away my autonomy. During my methodical examination of the bathroom, I discovered something promising. In the back of the vanity cabinet, a small toolkit I'd stored there years ago when mounting new fixtures. Inside was a flat head screwdriver, a small hammer, and various screws. The doorknob was a privacy lock, relatively simple in construction. With renewed determination, I set to work disassembling it, carefully removing the screws and studying its mechanism. It took hours of patient work, my fingers bloody from slips of the screwdriver. But eventually, I managed to dismantle the locking mechanism. When the door finally swung open, the house was dark and silent. According to the clock in the bedroom, it was just past 3 in the morning. They were all asleep, unaware that their prisoner had freed herself. Moving silently through the house that had once been my pride and joy, I gathered a few essential belongings from my basement room. My purse with identification and credit cards, a change of clothes, my real estate license and professional contacts list. Then I slipped out the back door into the cool Seattle night, a free woman with vengeance in her heart. I checked into a hotel downtown using cash, not wanting to leave an electronic trail. The luxurious bathroom and king-sized bed felt like paradise after my imprisonment, but I allowed myself only a brief rest. By 9 the next morning, I was sitting in my attorney's office, a man who had handled my real estate transactions for over 20 years. "Susan, what you're describing is criminal," Harold said after listening to my story, his face grave. "We should go to the police immediately." I shook my head. "And say, what exactly? That my son locked me in a bathroom? It would be my word against his and Heather's. They've been laying groundwork for months to paint me as mentally unstable." "Then what do you want to do?" Harold asked. "I want to hit them where it hurts most, I said firmly. The house. I'm still co-owner, correct? Harold nodded. Yes, your name is still on the deed, but typically both owners would need to consent to any sale. Typically, I repeated. But are there exceptions? Harold's expression shifted as he understood my intention. There are certain circumstances where one co-owner can force a sale, especially if there's evidence of financial malfeasance or failure to maintain the property appropriately. He pulled out a thick law book and began researching, while I sat quietly, my resolve hardening with each passing minute. After about 20 minutes, Harold looked up with a gleam in his eye. Here's something. In Washington state, if one co-owner can prove that the other has substantially devalued the property through unauthorized modifications or by encumbering it with excessive debt, they can petition for a partition by sale. And Thomas has done both, I said. Exactly. Plus, given your background in real estate, the court would likely view you as the more knowledgeable party regarding property value. We spent the next 3 hours formulating a plan. I would need to document the unauthorized renovations and the loans Thomas had taken out against the property. I would need to establish my own mental competence through evaluations with independent doctors. And I would need to move quickly before Thomas realized I was missing and took countermeasures. From Harold's office, I went directly to my bank, where I withdrew substantial cash and liquidated several investments, transferring the funds to accounts only I could access. I then contacted a former colleague, Patricia, who was still active in Seattle real estate. Patricia, I need to quietly list a property, and I need buyers who can move extremely quickly with cash. I explained over coffee later that day. What's the catch? She asked, always perceptive. Co-ownership situation complicated family dynamics. I replied vaguely. The property is worth $1.8 million, but I'm willing to accept $1.7 for a fast, no questions asked sale. Patricia raised an eyebrow. That's a $100,000 discount. Must be quite the complicated situation. You have no idea, I said grimly. Within 48 hours, Patricia had found potential buyers, a wealthy couple relocating from San Francisco who needed a home immediately and had cash available. They viewed the property while Thomas, Heather, and the children were away at a school event. Patricia had arranged the showing by claiming to be working with prospective buyers for a nearby property who wanted to see comparable homes in the neighborhood. The San Francisco couple loved the house and made an offer on the spot. $1.7 million, all cash, with a 7-day closing period. I accepted immediately. Meanwhile, Harold had been building the legal case for the partition by sale. He documented the unauthorized loans, now totaling nearly $800,000, that Thomas had taken against the property. He gathered evidence of the unpermitted renovations that had altered the home's historical character, potentially reducing its value in Seattle's preservation-conscious market. Most importantly, I underwent thorough psychological evaluations with 2 independent psychiatrists, both of whom declared me fully competent and showing no signs of cognitive decline or mental illness. Thomas and his family were scheduled to take a week-long trip to Disneyland, a vacation they'd been planning for months. It was the perfect opportunity. The day after they left, we closed the sale. The new owners took possession immediately, and I received a bank transfer for approximately $850,000, my half, after the existing loans were paid off. That same day, I visited 3 different banks, setting up offshore accounts in places where financial privacy was still respected. I purchased a one-way ticket to Lisbon, Portugal, a country I'd researched extensively for its favorable residency policies for retirees and its distance from Seattle. Before leaving, I wrote a letter and left it on the kitchen counter of what had been my home for so many years. Thomas, by the time you read this, I will be gone, and so will your house. As co-owner, I had every legal right to sell the property, especially after documenting the unauthorized debt you've placed on it and the unpermitted renovations you've made. Your plan to have me declared incompetent has failed. Multiple medical professionals have certified my mental fitness, copies of which are now with my attorney. I raised you better than this. I sacrificed everything to give you a good life. And your betrayal is something I will never understand or forgive. Do not attempt to find me. Mom. 24 hours later, I was on a plane crossing the Atlantic, leaving behind the city where I'd spent my entire life, the son who had betrayed me, and the grandchildren I adored but could no longer safely see. I was 68 years old and starting completely over alone, but finally free. Portugal welcomed me like an old friend I didn't know I had. I settled in a small coastal village called Cascais, about 30 minutes from Lisbon. It offered the perfect balance of peaceful living, with access to city amenities when needed. Most importantly, it was a place where no one knew me or my history. I found a beautiful two-bedroom villa with ocean views for a fraction of what comparable property would cost in Seattle. The house was smaller than my old home, but perfect for my needs, with a lovely garden where I could grow herbs and flowers in the Mediterranean climate. The first few months were difficult. Despite the justified anger that had fueled my escape, the reality of my isolation hit hard. I missed my grandchildren terribly. Jack's shy smile, Lily's exuberant hugs, the sound of their laughter. Some nights I would wake up crying, wondering if I'd made the right choice. But then I would remember the cold calculation in Thomas's eyes as he locked me away, the casual cruelty in his voice, as he gaslighted me, and I knew I had done what was necessary for my survival. I threw myself into building a new life. I enrolled in Portuguese language classes, determined to integrate into my adopted community. I joined a local expat group where I met other foreigners who had chosen Portugal for their retirement. Many had their own stories of reinvention, though none quite as dramatic as mine. One of these new friends, a British woman named Margaret, became particularly important to me. She had moved to Portugal after her husband's death and understood the unique grief of losing family, though in a different way than I had. We make our own family sometimes. She told me over coffee one day as we watched the Atlantic waves crash against the shoreline. The family we choose can be more loyal than the family we're born into or create. Her words became my mantra as I slowly built a circle of trusted friends. I was careful about what I shared, telling most people a simplified version of my story, widowed, retired, seeking adventure in my golden years. Only Margaret knew the full truth, and she kept my confidence absolutely. Meanwhile, through a trusted former colleague back in Seattle, I occasionally received updates about Thomas and his family. The sale of the house had hit them hard. They had returned from their Disneyland trip to find strangers living in their home, and my note on the kitchen counter. Thomas had indeed hired private investigators to try to find me, but I had covered my tracks well. The money had been moved through multiple accounts before reaching my final destinations, and I had established residency in Portugal using perfectly legal means that nevertheless made me difficult to trace. According to my Seattle informant, Thomas and Heather's marriage had not survived the financial and emotional upheaval. They had divorced within a year of my disappearance. Thomas had been forced to declare bankruptcy after losing the house, as his spending habits and financial mismanagement caught up with him. Heather had taken the children and moved to Portland to live with her parents. I took no joy in Thomas's suffering, but neither did I feel responsible for it. He had made his choices that would have destroyed me had I not acted first. In Portugal, I found purpose again, through unexpected means. Many elderly expatriates in the area struggled with language barriers when dealing with healthcare and government services. With my growing Portuguese skills, I began volunteering as a translator and advocate. This work introduced me to dozens of interesting people and gave my days meaning beyond my own concerns. I made a comfortable home in my villa, adopting 2 street cats who became my constant companions. I planted a garden with vegetables and flowers. I learned to cook Portuguese dishes and hosted small dinner parties for my new friends. I took up watercolor painting, capturing the stunning coastal landscapes on canvas. For 5 years, this was my life. Peaceful, meaningful, and increasingly happy, though always with the undercurrent of loss when I thought about Jack and Lily growing up without me. They would be teenagers now, I realized one day with a pang of regret. Jack would be 17, Lily 15. So many milestones I had missed. That realization sparked an idea that I couldn't shake away to reach out without endangering the new life I had built. After much contemplation, I decided to write letters to my grandchildren to be delivered on their 18th birthdays. I would tell them the truth about what had happened, express my undying love for them, and leave the door open for contact when they were adults, able to make their own decisions. I wrote these letters over many weeks, pouring my heart onto the pages. When finished, I sent them to my trusted friend in Seattle with specific instructions for their future delivery. It was a leap of faith, a pebble tossed into the ocean of time, with no guarantee it would ever reach its intended shore. What I never expected was how quickly that pebble would return to me as a wave. 6 months after sending those letters to my friend in Seattle, I received an unexpected email. The subject line simply read, Grandma. The sender was an address I didn't recognize, jackthomas2007@gmail.com. My hands trembled as I clicked to open it. Dear Grandma Susan, this is Jack, your grandson. I'm 17 now. I know I'm not supposed to have your letter yet, but Mrs. Jenkins, your friend, thought I should have it early. I found her through some detective work after overhearing Dad talking about you one night when he was drunk. I remember you. I remember how you used to make cinnamon toast cut into triangles exactly the way I liked it. I remember how you taught me to build the best Lego towers by creating a strong foundation first. I remember you. Dad told us you had mental problems and had to go away for treatment. Later, he said you'd abandoned us because you didn't care. But I never believed that. The grandma who cried when I made you a Mother's Day card in first grade wouldn't just stop loving us. I'm in my last year of high school now. Lily is 15 and in 10th grade. We live with Mom in Portland but visit Dad in Seattle some weekends. He's not doing well. He lost everything after what happened with the house, and he drinks too much now. I don't know the whole story, but your letter filled in a lot of blanks. Dad did something terrible to you, didn't he? Something he never talks about, but that changed everything. Is it really true that you live in Portugal? That seems so far away and exotic. Could we maybe talk sometime? I have so many questions. If this isn't my grandma reading this, I'm sorry to bother you. But if it is you, please write back. Love, Jack. Tears streamed down my face as I read and reread the email. My grandson, my Jack, had found me. His words brought back a flood of memories, both painful and precious. The way he remembered specific details about our relationship pierced straight through to my heart. I hesitated before responding. Was this a trick? Could Thomas somehow be using Jack to locate me? But the details Jack mentioned were so personal, so specific. This had to really be him. With trembling fingers, I wrote back, My dearest Jack, yes, it's really me, your Grandma Susan. I can hardly type through my tears of joy at hearing from you. Not a day has gone by that I haven't thought of you and Lily and wondered how you were growing up. You're right that something bad happened between your father and me. The full story is complicated and painful, and some parts of it might be better discussed when you're a bit older. What matters most is that I never ever stopped loving you and your sister. Leaving you behind was the hardest thing I've ever done. Life in Portugal has been good to me. I live in a small village by the ocean called Cascais. My house has a garden where I grow tomatoes and roses. I have 2 cats named Salt and Pepper because one is white and one is black. I would love to talk with you. Would a video call be possible? I understand if you need to keep this private from your parents for now. All my love, Grandma Susan. Jack responded within hours, eager to set up a video call. We arranged to speak the following Saturday, when he would have privacy at a friend's house. When his face appeared on my computer screen that weekend, I gasped. The little boy I remembered had been replaced by a young man with Thomas's strong jaw, but my own blue eyes. He looked so grown up, so serious, yet when he smiled, I could still see traces of the child I'd known. Grandma, he said tentatively. Oh, Jack, I whispered, touching the screen. Look at you, so handsome, so grown up. We talked for nearly 3 hours that first time. Jack was cautious at first, testing to see if I was really the grandmother he remembered. He asked about specific memories, events from his childhood that only I would know. With each correct answer, he relaxed a little more. Dad locked you in a bathroom, he asked when we finally addressed the elephant in the room. For 2 whole days, I nodded. It was a terrible time, Jack. Your father was under financial pressure making bad decisions. He and your mother wanted my house and my money. And when I confronted them, things escalated in ways I never could have imagined. That's messed up, Jack said, shaking his head. Really messed up. It was, I agreed. But I want you to know something important. What happened between your father and me doesn't change the fact that he's your father. And despite everything, I believe he loves you and Lily in his own way. Jack's expression hardened. He's not a good person, Grandma. After you left, he fell apart. He lost his job, started drinking all the time. Mom couldn't deal with it anymore, so she took us to Portland. He sees us maybe once a month now, and half the time, he cancels at the last minute. My heart ached for this young man who had lost so much, including respect for his father. People make terrible mistakes, Jack. Sometimes those mistakes define them, and sometimes they learn and grow from them. Have you forgiven him? Jack asked directly. I considered the question carefully. No, I admitted finally. I haven't forgiven him. But I found peace despite what he did. I've built a good life here. Does Lily know about you? About the letter? I asked. Jack shook his head. Not yet. She was younger when everything happened, doesn't remember as much. She's also closer to Dad than I am. I wanted to make sure you were really okay before telling her. I understand, I said. That's very thoughtful and protective of you. As our call neared its end, Jack asked the question I'd been both hoping for and dreading. Could I come visit you? Maybe this summer, after graduation. I've been saving money from my job at the grocery store. The thought of seeing my grandson in person, after so many years, brought fresh tears to my eyes. I would love that more than anything, Jack. But let's be smart about how we handle this. Your father might still be looking for me. We made tentative plans for a summer visit, with Jack creating a cover story about a European graduation trip with friends. Before we ended the call, he had one more surprise for me. Hang on, Grandma. Someone wants to say hi. The camera shifted, and suddenly there was Lily, my beautiful granddaughter, her eyes wide and uncertain. Is it really you? She whispered. It's me, sweetheart, I said, my voice breaking. My Lily flower. Her face crumpled, and she began to cry. I thought you didn't want us anymore. Dad said you were sick and didn't love us. That was never ever true, I said firmly. I have loved you every single day of your life, and I will love you until my last breath. Jack put his arm around his sister, and they sat together, looking at me, these precious children I had thought lost to me forever. In that moment, despite the ocean between us and the years of separation, I felt more complete than I had since fleeing Seattle 5 years earlier. True to his word, Jack arranged to visit me that summer, bringing Lily with him. Their mother surprisingly supported the trip after Jack carefully explained some of what had happened. Heather, it seemed, had her own regrets about her role in my mistreatment. The day they arrived at Lisbon Airport was the happiest of my new life. Holding my grandchildren again, feeling their arms around me, hearing their voices, not through a computer, but right beside me, was a joy I had never expected to experience again. During their 2-week visit, we made new memories to replace the years we'd lost. We explored the colorful streets of Lisbon, ate fresh seafood by the harbor in Cascais, and spent long evenings on my terrace watching the sunset over the Atlantic. I showed them my garden, introduced them to my friends, and shared with them the peaceful life I'd built from the ashes of betrayal. Jack and Lily returned to the States with promises to visit again, and plans for me to meet them in neutral locations like London or Paris in the future. Thomas never learned of our reunion, a secret the children kept carefully. As for me, I remained in my Portuguese sanctuary, no longer hiding, but simply living the life I had chosen. The wound of Thomas's betrayal would never completely heal, but it no longer defined me. I had reclaimed not only my financial security, but also the most precious relationship of all that with my beloved grandchildren. Life's most valuable lesson I discovered wasn't about revenge but resilience. Sometimes you have to lose everything to discover what truly matters. And sometimes when you least expect it, what you thought was lost forever finds its way back to you, like a letter across the ocean carrying your name. The letters my grandchildren opened did more than reconnect us. They opened a new chapter in all our lives. After that first summer visit, Jack decided to apply to universities in Europe, eventually securing a scholarship to study international business in Lisbon. Having my grandson just a short train ride away has been one of life's greatest unexpected gifts. Lily follows a different path but stays equally connected. Though she returned to the States for college, she spends every summer with me in Portugal, learning Portuguese and developing a deep love for photography, capturing the stunning coastal landscapes that have become her artistic signature. Thomas eventually learned of our reconnection after Jack graduated from college. His reaction was not what any of us expected. Rather than anger or attempts to interfere, he sent me a simple message through Jack: "I'm sorry, you deserved better." Those 7 words couldn't erase years of pain, but they acknowledged the truth, which was more than I had ever expected to receive from my son. We have not spoken directly, and perhaps we never will. Some bridges once burned cannot be rebuilt. But the acknowledgement of wrongdoing allowed me to release some of the heaviness I had carried. Today at 73, I look back on the past 5 years since reconnecting with my grandchildren as a time of healing I never thought possible. My Portuguese village is truly home now. I've become somewhat of a local character, the American grandmother who helps other expatriates navigate their new lives. My garden has expanded, my language skills have flourished, and my heart has gradually mended. The bathroom imprisonment that once defined my trauma has faded into a story I rarely think about anymore. The house that represented both my greatest asset and my prison is now just a memory replaced by this sun-washed villa, where laughter and love have returned to my life. If there's wisdom I've gained from this journey, it's this: when someone shows you who they truly are through their actions, believe them. But also believe in your own strength to begin again no matter your age or circumstances. And never underestimate the power of truth to eventually find its way into the light. Most importantly, I've learned that family is defined not by blood or obligation, but by love and respect. The family we choose or who choose us can bring the deepest healing after betrayal. I often sit on my terrace in the evening, watching the sun set over the Atlantic, grateful for the peace I've found. Sometimes Jack joins me when he visits from Lisbon, or Lily when she's here for summer break. In those moments with the warm breeze carrying the scent of salt and flowers, I know that despite everything, I'm exactly where I'm meant to be. Have you ever had to make a difficult decision to protect yourself, even from family, or found the courage to start over when it seemed impossible? Share your story in the comments below. Sometimes knowing we're not alone in our struggles is the greatest comfort. And if this story touched you, please subscribe and give it a thumbs up. Your support means the world to someone who found her voice again after being silenced. Thank you for listening. And remember, it's never too late to rewrite your story.